Elvis Presley pushed open the worn door of Millie's diner just past midnight, the heat of the studio still clinging to his dark leather jacket. He'd slipped in behind the coffee pot, craving a moment's anonymity and an honest meal. The neon sign outside flickered, and through the front window he saw her. A young woman cradling an infant, cheeks hollow with worry, begging scraps from the cook who refused her a plate. Inside, she hovered by the counter, voice trembling. "Please, I just need a handful for my baby." Her eyes darted to every stranger in the room, as if pleading for salvation. None met her gaze. Elvis paused, phone pressed to his ear in the back hallway, listening to his tour manager's updates. But his world narrowed to that trembling figure and the hungry child at her hip. He slipped off the receiver, stepped into the cool glare of the dining room, and watched as she braced herself on trembling knees, unaware that the man she implored sat only feet away. A harsh Memphis sun beat down on the lonely stretch of highway, where the little roadside diner sat like a mirage. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of frying grease and stale coffee. Margaret West navigated the narrow corridor behind the counter, her apron stained with yesterday's gravy drips. At 23, she had the world's weariness in her eyes. Her father's stroke had left him half-paralyzed, her mother long gone, and now her own slender shoulders bore the weight of bills and mounting medical expenses. Tonight, word had trickled back to the management that the king himself planned to drop in for a quiet, unannounced meal after his late-night studio session. But Margaret had no time to flutter at the thought of royalty walking among them. She simply pushed her dark hair from her face and kept plating omelets. Out front, a woman in threadbare clothes stood, clutching a wailing infant. The child's cheeks were sunburned, its eyes rimmed red with hunger. The woman's arm shook as she offered a trembling hand to the cook at the grill, hoping for leftover scraps. "Please," she whispered, her voice ragged with fatigue. "Anything. My boy, he hasn't eaten for 2 days." Inside, the cook glanced at the clock, then at the woman's hollowed frame. He shook his head and turned away. The diner's worn tile floor echoed with her despairing sobs. No one moved to help. No one dared draw attention to the scene playing out mere feet from their booths. Only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the hiss of the grill filled the room. Margaret glanced over her shoulder as the door chimed. Her manager's delay in bringing supplies had cost them more time. She felt a tug at her conscience, but was frozen by the fear of losing this lifeline of a job. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned back to the sink, listening as the woman's pleading diminished to stifled cries. Then, through the haze of oil smoke, she saw him, Elvis Presley, not emerging through velvet ropes or flanked by burly guards, but slipping in alone, looking ordinary in a plain white shirt and worn jeans. His sunglasses caught the single bare bulb's glare, and for a heartbeat Margaret thought he might be another drifter seeking refuge from the noon heat. He settled at a booth near the window, carefully placing his dark fedora beside his plate. Without a word, he ordered black coffee and a simple grilled cheese sandwich, paying no heed to the whispers that floated behind his back. Margaret's heart thudded as the king, her childhood soundtrack, the distant voice on her mother's worn vinyl, became flesh in her world-weary diner. He lifted the phone and dialed, his voice husky as he spoke to the tour manager. The baby's cry carried through the door crack, and Margaret felt her stomach twist. Instinctively, an impulse rose in her chest. She grabbed a plate, ran to the back, and with trembling hands tore a corner from the thick wedge of the last sandwich she had slated for herself. Carefully, she returned to the counter and slid the plate to the frightened mother. "Here," she said softly, her voice breaking the diner's heavy silence. You shouldn't have to wait for your child to be fed." The woman looked up by reflex, her eyes wide, and the baby clamped its tiny fingers around the bread. Margaret turned back to the kitchen door, but then a quiet authority brushed past her. The moment the phone line clicked, and Elvis descended the corridor. He paused, his tall frame silhouetted in the doorway, and Margaret heard him say, "I'm back." He stepped into the cramped dining room. All conversation stopped. Even the sizzle of the grill outside the kitchen door seemed to hush. Elvis moved toward the young mother, his gaze warm, curious. He knelt, not as a superstar, but as a man who had known hardship. He reached out and gently took the infant from her arms, cradling the child with a tenderness that startled Margaret. "Thank you," he said, not to her, but to the woman. "No one should be hungry." Margaret felt tears burn her eyes. That single act, the soft strength in his voice, shattered something inside her. She watched as he handed the baby back, then rose and turned to her. Removing his sunglasses, he met her gaze, and in that moment she saw more than stardom. She saw a soul that recognized suffering and refused to look away. He nodded once, a brief, profound acknowledgement, then returned to his booth, leaving Margaret to absorb the enormity of what had transpired. For an instant, the diner felt smaller, more fragile, yet somehow suffused with possibility. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, but Margaret's world ignited with a light she had thought long extinguished. In the simple sharing of a sandwich, in the quiet compassion of a stranger who turned out to be the king, she glimpsed a truth she would carry forward. Compassion knows no rank, and kindness can rewrite destinies. The morning sun had barely crawled above the horizon when Margaret West answered the shrill ring of her kitchen phone. Her father's oxygen machine hissed softly nearby, reminding her of responsibilities waiting at home even before dawn. She wiped flour from her hands, tonight's pancake batter, left unwashed after the dinner rush, and lifted the receiver. "Margaret?" barked the voice on the other end, trembling with agitation. It was Carlton, the diner manager. His tone carried an edge sharper than the knives in the kitchen. "I need you in at 6:30, he continued without greeting. "After what you did last night, we can't have people poking around. You're off the schedule. Effective immediately." Margaret's chest tightened. The echo of Carlton's words hammered in her mind. Effective immediately. She was fired. No discussions, no second chances. She held the receiver as if bracing for a blow, then gently replaced it. Her gaze fell on the breakfast dishes scattered on the table, the single chair pushed back, her father's worn slippers by the doorway. She didn't cry. She simply turned her back on a life already fraying around the edges and began gathering her few personal items: an apron, her purse, a photograph of her mother and late brother tucked in a faded frame. Outside, the world felt colder, as though the sun had finally forgotten how to rise. 2 days later, as dusk settled over Memphis with a bruised purple sky, a sleek black Cadillac coasted through Margaret's quiet neighborhood. She stepped off the bus, clutching a canvas tote, groceries and medicine for her father, when the car door swung open and a familiar rumbling voice called her name. "Margaret West?" She froze. The voice belonged to Vernon Presley's chauffeur, the man who drove Elvis each night to Graceland after studio sessions. In his gloved hand, he held an envelope embossed with an elegant crest. "I have a message for you, if you'd come with me for just a moment." The chauffeur's tone was gentle, but insistent. Fear and confusion chased through Margaret's mind, but the reality of her unemployment and the impossibility of feeding her father without income pushed her forward. She slid into the back seat of the Cadillac. The leather smelled of polished wood and faint perfume, a world away from the crackling linoleum of the diner's kitchen. They drove in near silence, the streetlights flickering past like distant fireflies. Finally, the car pulled up in front of Graceland. Margaret's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she followed the chauffeur through the wrought-iron gates and onto the Bruton Place driveway. Members of Elvis's inner circle stood respectfully in the shadows, giving her a wide berth. Then, at the entrance to the living room, Elvis Presley himself emerged. Gone were the sunglasses and fedora. Instead, he stood with the shy confidence of a man who knew both his greatness and his faults. His shirt was simple, unadorned, his jeans worn at the knee, but the warmth in his copper-brown eyes was unmistakable. "Margaret," he said softly, extending the envelope, "I understand you were let go, and I want to make sure you're all right." She opened the letter with trembling fingers. Inside was a personal check, enough to cover her father's medical bills for months, to keep a roof overhead and groceries on the table, and a note in elegant script: "For the kindness you showed my daughter, and for seeing her as you would have me seen. Not as a legend, but as a man. Use this to ease your burden." EP tears welled without warning. She looked up at him, but he offered no banter nor applause. He simply nodded and said, "I also have a proposal." He motioned toward his assistant, who brought forward another envelope containing an invitation: a position as coordinator for a new charitable fund at Graceland, one dedicated to supporting single parents in need. Margaret closed her eyes. Pride waged war with necessity in her chest. She had never asked for charity. She bore her struggles alone. Yet here was this man, once an idol on her mother's dusty record player, offering her both financial relief and meaningful work. I can't accept this," she whispered. Elvis shook his head, his expression unyielding yet kind. "You already made a difference to me and my family. Let me return the favor." He pointed to the chandelier-flickered ceiling, then back to her. "You have a gift for caring. It shouldn't go unnoticed." Margaret felt the mantle of his words settle upon her like a blessing. The past 2 days of humiliation melted in the glow of genuine recognition. She wiped her tears and nodded. I'll do it," she said, her voice firm at last. "Thank you." He smiled, tender, relieved, almost boyish in its sincerity. "We'll start tomorrow." That night, as the Cadillac pulled away, Margaret looked back at the lights of Graceland fading behind her. She clutched the envelopes to her chest, her future suddenly brighter than the old neon diner sign which once defined her world. The daughter of a stroke-ravaged father, cashiered by indifference, had now a role far beyond serving coffee and plates of greasy eggs. Through her simple act of compassion toward a hungry child, she had become the architect of her own redemption, and a beacon of hope for countless others still fighting to be seen. Margaret West awoke the next morning to an unusual quiet in her modest bungalow. The usual hum of her father's oxygen machine was oddly muted, as if reality itself had paused overnight. Light filtered in through threadbare curtains, painting soft patterns on the linoleum floor where, only hours before, yesterday's dishes and her paycheck stub had lain. Now, in their place, sat 2 crisp white envelopes with the regal Presley crest. She hesitated before touching them. One was the check, enough to see her family through the leanest months. The other bore an embossed invitation, and, tucked inside, a typed card. "Margaret, your compassion has given me more than I can ever repay. Tonight, I would like to show you the same kindness you showed my daughter. I'll be at the cafe on Ridgeway Road at 7 p.m. Come if you can." EP Margaret's breath caught. The cafe on Ridgeway was the very place she'd brought home leftover coffee for her father and hot soup for her little brother in her school days, long before she became an unemployed single parent. Memories swirled, her mother's lullabies, the scuff of worn sneakers on sidewalk cracks, the ache of having to ask strangers for mercy. She dressed carefully, smoothing her hair and straightening the pale blue dress she reserved for church. Outside the house, the late afternoon sun glowed amber. In the distance, the silhouette of the Cadillac shimmered like a mirage, and she found herself holding both envelopes as though they were heirlooms rather than simple paper. At the cafe, the smell of frying grease and brewed coffee welcomed her. The place had changed little since she worked there, save for fresh vinyl seats and a new coat of paint. At a corner table, Elvis Presley sat alone. He'd traded his dark sunglasses for clear frames and his usual rhinestone-studded jacket for a simple denim shirt. He looked entirely at ease among the booth tables and chrome bar stools, as though he belonged here rather than on any stage. "Margaret," he greeted, standing as she approached. His voice was low, but its warmth reached her like sunshine warming chilled shoulders. "Mr. Presley," she managed, sliding into the booth opposite him. He offered her a small, apologetic smile. "Please, call me Elvis. I thought it better if we spoke where you once worked." She nodded and set the envelopes on the Formica tabletop. Elvis picked up the outer envelope. "I understand if you feel uncomfortable," he said. "I don't want charity. I want to give you an opportunity." Margaret's heart pounded. She traced the raised lettering on the invitation. Opportunity for what? He reached into his pocket and produced a thick manila folder stamped Graceland Charitable Foundation. He slid it across to her. Inside were official documents, articles of incorporation for a new nonprofit dedicated to supporting families affected by war, illness, and poverty, particularly single mothers. A cover letter stated that he intended to seed the fund with $500,000 and sought a coordinator to launch the first community outreach program, a network of support groups providing food, medical referrals, and job training. "I was in that booth last night," Elvis said quietly, "watching you offer food to a mother and child. Your courage and kindness have stayed with me. I want you to lead this foundation, not as an employee, as a partner." Tears gathered in Margaret's eyes. She thought of her father's labored breathing, her brother's gaunt cheeks, and her own exhaustion. "Elvis, I don't know what to say. I've never—" He leaned forward. "I know you're proud, and I respect that more than you know. But pride doesn't put food on a table or pay for medicine. This isn't a gift you owe me. It's a calling you deserve." Margaret swallowed hard. The dossier detailed monthly stipends, an office at Graceland, and an annual budget to develop community centers across Mississippi and Tennessee. She touched the letter with trembling fingers. This will help so many people." He nodded. "People like you, like your family, like the woman in that booth last night." Silence hung between them, filled only by the hiss of the coffee machine and idle clatter of dishes. Then Margaret exhaled, steeling herself. "Elvis, I accept." Relief and gratitude shone in his eyes. He offered his hand. "Welcome aboard." Over the following weeks, Margaret's life transformed. She worked from a modest office at Graceland, drafting outreach proposals and coordinating with partner agencies. She traveled to rural clinics, held town hall meetings in converted church basements, and forged a network of volunteers who still trembled at the mere mention of Elvis Presley, but who soon put aside their awe in the face of her unwavering dedication. One chilly October afternoon, she visited Mrs. Grayson's boarding house. the first beneficiary of the Foundation's new rental assistance program. The elderly woman wept as Margaret delivered months of mortgage payments and heating vouchers. Mrs. Grayson pressed Margaret's hands to her chest, her eyes bright with gratitude. "God bless you, child," she whispered. Margaret simply squeezed her hand. She understood now that kindness wasn't a single act, but a ripple set in motion, touching lives far beyond those present. Back at Graceland, Elvis congratulated her on a successful launch event. The two stood on the veranda, looking out over the gardens where autumn leaves drifted like embers in twilight. "You've made a difference," he said, voice low with pride. "I knew you would." Margaret turned to face him, feeling the weight of gratitude and responsibility in her chest. "I couldn't have done it without you." He shook his head gently. "You did it all." Behind them, a song drifted from the open doors of the mansion, a singer rehearsing "If I Can Dream." Margaret watched as Elvis closed his eyes, the melody mingling with memories of that first day in the diner. She remembered the worn linoleum, the hiss of the jukebox, and the kindness of Margaret West. Now, Margaret West, founding director of the Graceland Charitable Foundation. As the final notes echoed into the night, she realized that sometimes the greatest legacies are not trophies or gold records, but the lives we touch and the hope we pass along. And in that moment, standing beside a man who needed no introduction, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. Winter settled over Memphis like a soft blanket, the frost-dusted lawns and bare trees glinting beneath street lamps that flickered against the night sky. Inside Graceland's grand hall, strings of white lights draped the walls and cast a warm glow on the assembled families, volunteers, and guests. A towering spruce stood at the room's far corner, adorned with simple ornaments crafted by children in the Foundation's after-school program. Margaret West moved quietly through the crowd, greeting familiar faces, mothers whose eyes filled with relief when they spotted her, veterans who clasped her hand in thanks, and artists who had donated their talents to the evening's auction. Tables were set with modest fare, the ham and collard greens, sweet potato casserole, and miniature pecan pies, and the soft hum of conversation mingled with the delicate notes of a harpist playing in the corner. From the foot of the stage, Margaret spotted Elvis Presley slipping in through a side door. He wore a dark velvet coat that shimmered under the lights, and his hair was immaculately combed. Yet there was no entourage behind him, only Joe Esposito, holding a stack of handwritten notes. The presence of the man who had become her partner in this mission still astonished her. The world's greatest showman here to celebrate her work, not his own. The hush that fell over the room when Elvis took the stage was palpable. Margaret exchanged a glance with his secretary, who gave her a slight, encouraging nod. Then the king of rock and roll stepped to the microphone, cleared his throat, and addressed the audience. "Good evening, everybody," he began, his voice rich yet gentle. "I promised Margaret that tonight wouldn't be about me." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Young mothers clutching infants, grandfathers in knitted caps, teenagers with bright eyes. "Tonight is about her." A wave of applause rose, but he held up his hand to quiet it. "When Margaret first brought a fan-made mini Christmas card to me, scribbled with the words, 'Thank you for helping me,' I thought it was sweet, but I realized something important. Margaret's work doesn't come from a place of fame or obligation. It comes from the heart." He produced from his coat pocket a simple box, polished wood with brass hinges, and placed it on the edge of the stage. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized the elegant emblem of the Graceland Foundation carved on its lid. "This," he said, lifting the lid, "is the first annual Margaret West Fund." Inside lay a series of engraved plaques bearing the names of the many women and families helped this year. Every plaque represents a life turned around. Another mother whose child won't go to bed hungry, another veteran who found a job, another family given a place to call home. Tears glistened on Margaret's cheeks as she rose from her seat. Elvis stepped aside, gesturing toward the box. She approached the stage, her heart pounding. Though 1,000 words rushed through her mind, gratitude, disbelief, love, only one would surface. "Thank you," she whispered into the microphone, voice quivering. The audience leaned in, the hush deepening. "Not for the plaques, or the money, or even this beautiful celebration. Thank you for believing that kindness can change a life." He returned the microphone to his stand. "And thank you for teaching me that the greatest gift I could give is not a stage or a song, but a chance." Without missing a beat, the orchestra behind them struck the first chord of "If I Can Dream," its gentle melody weaving through the room like a promise. Margaret stood side by side with Elvis as the song unfolded, the words resonating not as a performance, but as a shared aspiration. Some in the crowd dabbed at their eyes, others clasped hands. As the final notes faded, Elvis and Margaret joined in a quiet embrace, framed by the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree. In that moment, they were no longer celebrity and administrator, but two souls bound by compassion. Later, as guests mingled under the vaulted ceilings, Margaret spotted a young boy dressed in a crisp blazer, one of the scholarship recipients. He shyly approached her and pressed into her hand a small, folded paper. Inside was a drawing, a child standing beside a smiling woman, both bathed in a radiant halo of color. Beneath it, in careful scrawl, "For the lady who gave me hope." Tears sprang to her eyes again. She knelt to the boy's level and whispered, "Thank you." Elvis appeared at her side, his expression soft. "She's yours," he murmured, nodding toward the sketch. Margaret looked up, meeting his gaze. "We're in this together," she replied, the two words carrying the weight of every life they had touched, and those yet to come. Outside, a light snowfall began, uncommon for a Memphis Christmas, but the soft flakes settled like confetti on the dark pavement. Margaret stepped out onto the veranda, Elvis at her side, as children pressed their faces to the windows, marveling at the gentle cascade. She placed a hand on the wooden railing, breathing in the night air scented with pine and promise. The distant sound of jingle bells drifted from the concert hall, mingling with laughter and song. In that quiet expanse between falling snowflakes, Margaret realized that her journey, from the worn linoleum floors of the roadside cafe to the heart of Graceland's generosity, had come full circle. And as she watched her daughter, now a proud volunteer in the kitchen below, serve smiling families during the after-concert feast, she understood at last the true meaning of that old Christmas promise. The smallest act of kindness can become the brightest light in someone's darkest hour.